Welcome to this afternoon session. It's my very great honor to have been asked to introduce the keynote presenter for this afternoon, Wilson Schaef, who, in her own words, is a recovering therapist as well as author, internationally recognized both in her training and in her writing. She's written 3 primary books that are having a really great impact on the thinking of people who are desiring to heal themselves all over Mother Earth. A Woman's Reality, Codependence, Misunderstood, Mistreated, and her latest book, which I just finished on the plane up here, When Society Becomes an Addict. She has a wide variety of experiences, both educationally and culturally. She has looked at human development from a theological point of view, from a psychological point of view, from a sociological point of view. And especially, I want to say, after hearing her and getting a chance to visit with her, the thing that is, I think, the thing I really enjoyed the most is that she's a fine human being who's honest. Not just truthful, but also honest. And who shares things from a very, very gifted and spiritual viewpoint that walks the spiritual path with practical feet. So at this time, I'd like us all to give a really great, loving welcome to Wilson Schaef.
Okay, we have a little less than an hour for me to try to tell you everything I know. I would like to try to get in more than When Society Becomes an Addict, partially because you can read that. I have another book coming out in March that I think is very key, and I want to say some things about that. And then I do want to take some time to say some things about what I call the living process system. And living in process, since I won't be doing the afternoon session, because I sandwiched this in between other commitments, because I wanted to be here. So let me just say a little bit. In the codependence workshop this morning, I talked a little bit about how I got into my own recovery. I want to say a little more about that because I think it's important. When I wrote Women's Reality, it was a book that I worked on for about 15 years. I had gone through traditional training, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Worked for the mental health system, SEEK mental health system. One of the things I discovered in the mental health system was that everybody got sick. The people who worked there, the clients, everybody. And I got sick. One of the things that happened to me was that I developed a rectal fissure. Now, I don't know whether some of you know what that is or not, but it's a hole in your colon. And what it does is it lets the shit out into your system. That seems symbolically important to me. When that was diagnosed, I resigned the next day and went into private practice. And when I went into private practice, a lot of women started coming to see me. And I very quickly discovered that I didn't know what I was doing with them. And so I decided to give a period of my life, however long it took, to find out what was going on in women. Now, it never occurred to me during that process I might perhaps find out what was going on in me. I was doing this purely as a therapist and wanted to know. That was a difficult time for me. And at 15 years, I spent listening to women wherever I could get myself in a group of women, set up a situation, et cetera, et cetera. And out of that finally came Women's Reality. And in Women's Reality, I described 3 systems. What I then called the reactive female system, which is a system that is externally defined, a stereotypic system, a system that has nothing to do with who women are or their experience of themselves. It's totally externally defined. And another system I called the white male system, and I called it the white male system because the power and influence in that system were held by white males. I was not talking about individual people. I was talking about a system. And some of the most white male system people I know, for example, are women. So I'm not talking about individuals here. I'm talking about a system. And then I talked about another system that I saw coming up as women became clear and felt safe with themselves. And that's what I called an emerging female system. Well, right about that time that that book came out, I was living in a household of all women and our children, and I mentioned that earlier. And what happened in that household was we became crazier and crazier and crazier. And my way of handling that was to book more out-of-town speaking engagements. I had to make amends to my children for that. But what would happen is I would come home from a speaking engagement and there would be lined up at the door all the people in the household with their complaints about what had happened while I was away. And being big mama codependent of the group, I was sure that I could straighten this out. So I would get the whole family seated in a circle, of course, in a circle. And then we would spend hours with my absolute best family therapy techniques. Now, what did you say to her? And how did you feel about what she said to you? And how do you feel about how she feels? And we went on and on. We worked on our communication. We worked on our interactions. We worked on our coalitions. And nothing happened. We just got sicker and sicker and sicker. Finally, it occurred to me that one of the women in the household was an alcoholic. Now, this had not occurred to me earlier because I was professionally trained. I had a unit on alcoholism in my graduate training. I think it was part of one class session. And therefore, I thought I knew about addictions. So it took me a long time to pick up on. And finally, I zeroed in on this woman's forgetfulness, which I think is interesting. And so I decided that she was alcoholic. Well, I then decided to make what we now euphemistically call an intervention. This was several years ago. I didn't know the word. I didn't know how you did it. Now, you all know that an intervention has to be planned and you involve key people and that you are not blaming or accusing. You say how the disease is affecting you and you have agreed upon consequence. You all know this about a good intervention. Well, my choice of an intervention was that she was coming into the bathroom as I was going out of the bathroom, and I thought I had the upper hand at that point. And so I said to her, "I think you're an alcoholic." And she said, "I think you're right." Well, almost literally, I was caught with my pants down because everybody knows that an alcoholic always denies it. When she agreed to that, I had no idea what to do next, and I just stood there staring at her. Well, consequently, she went to treatment, and then, as I said in the codependence workshop, we all went to treatment. I gathered up 13 of us, ex-husbands, secretary, their children, some clients who wanted to be included, anybody. We all went to treatment together, and because I don't do things halfway. And as I began to learn, first of all, about alcoholism, and I read everything. I went to 12-step meetings. I talked to people. I talked to myself about what I was learning and got more information from people. And I kept hearing myself say, well, you know, that's real similar to what I describe as the white male system. And that's real similar to what I call the white male system. And I kept hearing myself saying that for 2 years. What I realize now is I really didn't want to see the next step. And finally, I was speaking at a wellness conference in Minnesota, and I heard myself say, it's not just that the white male system supports addictions and demands addictions. Is that the white male system is an addict. That it functions exactly the same as an addict. It has the same characteristics and the same processes as an active addict. Now, I didn't want to see that because I know how difficult recovery is for the individual. And it seemed to me that it was overwhelming to think about a system in recovery. What I now know, I used to think, for example, of people at AA meetings who said I'm a grateful alcoholic. Secretly, I thought they were really nuts. That this proved how crazy they really were, I now know what that means. Because what I know is until we name the system as addict, it has no potential for recovery. And that actually naming it as addict is caring for the system. And to be into that denial system of not naming it as addict is not to care for the system in which we live. Not to name it does not give it the possibility of recovery. And I know it can recover if we all do our individual recovery and participate in that. So what happened just about that time when all this was coming together in my head is I had a client come in, and she was working on her nicotine and relationship addictions in addition to her psychological problems. And she said, Ann, all these addictions that we've been talking about, all the ingestive addictions, drugs, alcohol, food, salt, sugar, caffeine, nicotine, et cetera, all the process addictions, sex, love, money, work, religion, relationships, et cetera. She says, those are all secondary addictions. And I said, whoa. AA wouldn't agree with you on that. It says that, alcoholism is a primary disease. And she said, well, they just say that because it'll kill you. But any addiction will kill you. We know that now. A money addiction will kill you. A work addiction will kill you. A sex addiction will kill you. A salt addiction will kill you. It's just a matter of time with all of them. She said, that's not the issue. She said, I think the primary addictions in this society are the addictions to powerlessness and non-living. And I said, whoa, say some more. And she said, well, I'll give you an example. She said, I grew up in the South, but I don't think it's really important where I grew up. I think it's the same anywhere. She said, when I was a little girl, when I was alive, when I had energy, I was full of life, I was running around, I was noisy, I was sexual. She said, what I got from my three most formative institutions, my family, my church, my school, what they said to me was that I was a bad girl. She said, when I was sick or depressed or withdrawn or low energy, not alive, what they said to me was, what a good girl you are today. So she said, what I learned was that to be alive is bad. To be not alive is good. Now, I have often said that our parenting practices in this society, that as parents, we try to kill our children so they'll fit into a dead society. Think about what happened to you as a child when you were alive. When you were in touch with your aliveness, when you were in touch with your spirituality, when you were in touch with your whole life force, I'm sure you were told you were a bad kid. And think about how you were encouraged to be not alive. Well, I said, boy, that makes sense to me, because, when I'm working with people who are coming to terms with their addiction, one of the things I know that the very fact that they've come to see me means that they're choosing not to die. But I also know that that does not mean that they're choosing to live. That that's a separate and a different choice. And that most people never really choose to be fully alive. Being dry and not sober is choosing not to die and not choosing to live. I said, I also know that the person that's best adjusted to this society is the person who has chosen not to die because the society needs you to keep it going, and the person who has chosen not to live. The person who is best adjusted to this society is the zombie. Think about it. If you chose to be fully alive, could you return to your job tomorrow? I used to do some consulting with the bureaucracy in Washington. I don't think you can be alive and work in one of those buildings. I just don't think it's possible. There is no possibility of life. If you choose to be fully alive, you can't breathe the air in most of our cities. If you choose to be alive, you have to be aware of toxic waste. You have to be aware of the nuclear threat. You have to be aware of the implications of Chernobyl. You know, we are all being affected by Chernobyl, but we are not talking about it. Massive denial. If you choose to be fully alive, you have to be willing to face your denial system. And most of us are not willing to do that. Now, I know that you can choose not to die, not to actively participate in your own dying, without choosing to be fully alive. That's another different step. And just as we were talking about that, I was reminded of something that a friend of mine told me. She has her doctorate in the Romantic literature, and she did a great study of the Romantic literature. And she had said to me, you know, I love serendipities that have what seemingly no meaning, but later they become so important. And she had said to me one time, she said, you know, Anne, 80-some% of the poetry of the Romantic era is odes to dead virgins. Think about it. The ideal woman in the romantic idea is the dead virgin. Think how many of you have tried to be that and have difficulty succeeding. Thank God. So this made a lot of sense to me. And I began to see, at first when I was looking at this, is I thought, well, it's really interesting because the addictive system, or the white male system, needs addictions in order to keep going. It's like you have to shut off your awareness in order to be comfortable being not dead and not alive. You have to shut yourself off in order to do that. And addictions help you do that, whether it's chemical addiction or a process addiction. A relationship addiction can shut you off as much from your awareness as a chemical addiction can. We now know that. And I could see why the system supported addictive relationships. And my theory was that this is what we call true love in the society's addictive relationships. My theory about that was that the reason the society supports this is because an addictive relationship keeps you so busy you don't have any time to reflect on what's going on in the society, right? That was my theory. I think it's true. But I think it's bigger than that. I think the society itself functions as an addict. We can take every characteristic of the individual addict and we can see it functioning at a societal level. Now let's just run through a few. I want to allot my time carefully here. Let's take dishonesty. We all know that addicts are dishonest. That they lie about their usage, they lie about what's going on with them, they lie to themselves, they lie about their awareness, etc., etc., etc. How do we see this on a national level? Same thing. I mentioned in the codependent session this morning, have you ever listened to a political speech out of Washington? There is absolutely no way to listen to one of those and not, if you're in touch with yourself, and not be aware of the dishonesty. It's based on dishonesty. It permeates our society. Our builders have been dishonest about the amount of concrete they've been using in our bridges, and now they're falling down. Northwest Airlines has been lying about the mechanical condition of their airplanes, and now that's been exposed. It's part of the system to lie. It's an accepted part of the system. We have become so accustomed to lying that we don't know ourselves when we're lying, and we have shut off our mechanisms for seeing when other people are lying to us. Where is it you know when someone is lying to you? Right. It's not in your head, is it? It's right here in your solar plexus. Then you have to bring it up to your head to give it words. And sometimes you don't even know what they're lying about, right? But you know your gut feels uneasy. What do our addictions do? They shut off that internal awareness. And in doing that, they keep us from calling ourselves and other people on dishonesty. So that dishonesty becomes a part of the system. Now, as a nation, we function the same as an alcoholic in the way we use dishonesty and the way we have incorporated dishonesty into our institutions. You know, there's no institution that's more dishonest, for example, than the church. And that's really hard for people to look at because the church says it's there to foster our spirituality, doesn't it? And frequently the issue is the church is there to sell its brand. And it may or may not have anything to do with our spirituality. That's a lie. That's a lie. Frequently, we have what we call Lincoln logs, dualisms of things that go together. Niceness and dishonesty go together. It is not possible to get honest unless you're willing to let go of niceness. If you need to be nice, you're probably going to hang on to your dishonesty. Now, that doesn't mean that honest people are mean. They just aren't always nice. If you want to let go of your niceness and your dishonesty, you come out of your own truth. And that's what we all have to do to recover. Another characteristics of an addictive system, an addictive person, is what I call the illusion of control. Now, to me, this is a very key aspect of an addictive system. It's a system that is built on the belief that it is possible to control everything. In the individual, we see this, believing that I can control what I think, feel, and do, and also believing that I can control what you think, feel, and do. And that my job and that my prestige depends on my ability to do that. Think about those of you who are in executive positions or any kind. Isn't part of your job description in one way or another to be able to control what happens? And if you don't do that, you're a failure? That is the illusion of the society, that it's possible to control the universe. When you are living in an illusionary control system, it is not possible for you to live with the processes of the universe because you are always trying to control them. Now, we see it at every level of our society. For example, one of the things we do is like our great shopping malls. I assume you have them up here, I don't know. But in there, everything's controlled, isn't it? You get in there, you don't know whether it's summer, winter, or whatever, because everything is controlled. One of my favorite examples is the Americana Hotel in New York City. I love New York City. I used to live in East Harlem. And one of the things I love about New York City is the sounds, the smells, the stench, you know, the whole thing. In the Americana Hotel, they have piped in sound, piped in air, piped in scent, and then there's music. So you never have to experience New York City. You are in a cocoon that is controlled, a controlled environment. Now this whole control thing, we move to international and part of our universal way of functioning. We really believe that we can control everything that happens on this planet, don't we? And we try to do it. We not only believe that, but we believe that we can and should be able to control everything that happens in the universe. We're moving out. That's what Star Wars is really about. And we believe that that's a good thing. When an alcoholic does this in recovery, we say to them, unless you're willing to let go of your control illusion, there is no possibility that you can recover, don't we? We say you have to give up your dishonesty. You have to give up your illusion of control. You have to turn it over, let go and let God. But as a society, we have developed the illusion of control. We have honed it to a fine system. And our entire government, most of our agencies are built on the illusion of control. They are regulatory. That is their function in one form or another. And we see this at every level of the society. Let me just mention a few others because I want to get into some of these other ideas. Perfectionism, again, we can see it on an individual level. We see it on a societal level. The kind of thinking that we find in the alcoholic, which AA calls stinking thinking, actually, is the normal thinking process for the society. It is rational, it is logical, it is linear, and it frequently makes no sense. Think about it. When you are your most logical, rational, linear, you may be very logical, but you make no sense. That kind of thinking and the obsessive, ruminative thinking that we find in the disease of addictions, we find the same kind of thinking on a societal level. It's the very same thing. It's just being done on a different level. Self-centeredness, we find. Negativism. Greed and a zero-sum mentality, scarcity model. Our system is built on the belief that there's never enough. There's never enough to go around, so you have to grab. You remember the story of the warm fuzzies? That's about an addictive society. The warm fuzzies are just fine until you decide that there are not enough warm fuzzies, and then you start hoarding them, and then there aren't enough. That's part of addictive thinking. And most basically, I think, we find that in the addict, in AA they call it a spiritual bankruptcy or loss of your spirituality. In an addictive society, we have a loss of personal morality, a loss of touch with our spiritual base, a loss of touch with who we are, why we're here, what we're about. A loss of touch with the awareness is not only is every individual a spiritual being, but the society itself is a spiritual being. We have lost that in the society. We know nothing about it anymore on a societal level. Although we talk a lot about morality, and we talk a lot about religion, but we have lost what it means to be in touch with your personal morality, your personal spirituality, and at a societal level, the spirituality of a society. We don't know what that means anymore. Now, what are some of the processes that we find in the addict that we also find in the society? Because I think that it's the processes that really keep things going. I think the basic process of this society is an addictive process. And as I said this morning, I don't think we have even touched upon what that means or what that really is. But there are other processes that we see operating in the individual that we also see operating in the society that are sneaky. I think we don't know about these processes because we don't live in a process-oriented world. And it's really the processes that hold things together, not the contents. But in an addictive society, we don't know about process, and so we don't see these processes as clearly. Let me just mention a couple, three. One is what I call the process of the promise. That in an addictive society, we are hooked by the process of the promise. Whether it's we're going to keep the world safe from nuclear war, or whether it's there's going to be a chicken in every pot, or whether it's this company will give you what you want. What happens, or life everlasting, what happens is that we get hooked on the process of the promise, and it takes us away from living our life. The process of the promise is part of the addictive system. And we need to look at what we're promising and why we're doing it. I think the process of the promise is almost always a control issue. Another process that I think is very important to recognize in the addictive system is what I call the process of, I call it pseudopodic egoing actually, but it's sort of encapsulating. What happens is, every once in a while, it's like the addictive system has covered over what I call the living process system. Every once in a while, this living process system will break through. You'll do something, or something will happen that is really caring, loving, spiritual, etc. What the addictive system does with that is it encapsulates it, it owns it, and it uses it to perpetuate itself. It doesn't recognize, it refuses to recognize the existence of another system coming through. And when it does that, it doesn't label it as a separate system. And then it gets co-opted and used by the addictive system to perpetuate itself. Now, for example, I think that one of the things that we see very often are the processes that are familiar to women. Nurturing, caring, loving, being in touch with spirituality, etc. In some ways, those processes are really put down by the system. And simultaneously, they're encapsulated and used by the system to perpetuate itself and claimed as their own. Can you see that? It's a very tricky process of the system. And it's real easy to get involved in it because you are so grateful for the recognition. You see? I think that this is what's happening in some ways to some minority groups. I've been working with various minority groups around the lower 48. And what they'll say to me is, hey, I want to get the goodies of this system. And you white women are getting co-opted by it, but I know better. I won't. And what's happening is they're becoming part of the addictive system. And it's killing them. And I think this is real key. This is happening with native populations too. Another process that I think is, I just want to mention quickly, is what I call dualistic thinking. I believe that this is an important cornerstone of the addictive system. And dualism is absolutely fascinating to me because dualistic thinking serves several purposes. Two that are easily seen. One is that when we put things in a dualism, either this or that, what we're doing is feeding our illusion of control because we're taking a very complex world and we're setting it up into a this or that. And that feeds our illusion that we have control because it's simpler than it really is. The other thing that happens is when we set up a dualism, it usually keeps us stuck because we don't want either aspect of the dualism. So what happens is we stay stuck with the dualism. For example, the dualism of should I stay with my job, should I leave my job? You don't want to do either one, right? And so what happens is you stay stuck. And you don't have to really deal with what's going on with you. We were talking at lunch about another dualism, which I think is a real important one that we get into. And that one is going along with the system or fighting the system. Either way, see, I call these Lincoln Logs. People say that's dated, but I've been in stores and you can still buy Lincoln Logs. And I think of them as the little building blocks of our society. I used to think of them like in our head. At one point in my codependence, I thought if I could just go to Philippines and learn psychosurgery, I could go and I could operate out all these Lincoln Logs from people's heads. But I realized that I can't do that. Then I thought of them as pickup sticks. You know, they're all intermeshed in our head, and you pull one out and the others all change around, but they're still there. Now, the important thing about a Lincoln Log is as long as you're on the Lincoln Log, you're in the problem. Some people, very subtly and very occasionally, and part of the problem, will talk about finding some place in between. Ha ha ha. Tricky? You're still on the Lincoln Log when you do that. See that? Now, when you are going along with the system, or when you are fighting the system, either way you are in the system. You are feeding the system. The third option with dualistic thinking is always to find the third option. And that option, I think, is always what is my process. What is right for me. The question I always ask is, will this affect my sobriety? Will this threaten my sobriety? If it will, I can't do it. Now, I equate my sobriety, my process, and my spirituality. To me, they are the same thing. The question I ask about everything I do in my life is, will that threaten my process, my spirituality, my sobriety? If it will, I can't do it. There's no question. I simply can't do it because it's not worth it, no matter what it is. It's simply not worth it. Now, that is the way off the Lincoln Log. I believe if we simply looked at dualistic thinking in this society, we would make major changes. If we agreed to see how often we set up things as a dualism. Now, there's another characteristic of these dualisms that I think is important. I used one before, niceness and dishonesty. They are things that go together. They are inextricably bound. There is not a possibility of giving up one without giving up the other. You have to jump off the log. I think jumping off the log is making a system shift, a paradigm shift, is moving into a new way of being in the world. As long as you stay on that log, you've had it. Now, there are lots of these dualisms that I have in When Society Becomes an Addict. Another one that I think is real important is powerlessness and control. As long as you feel powerless as a person, now I'm not talking about the powerless they're talking about in step 1, because in step 1 of the 12-step program, it's I am powerless over my addiction. And of course you are. That's what an addiction is. I'm talking about personal power here. Powerlessness and control. As long as you feel powerless, you want to control your world. As long as you are trying to control your world, of course you'll feel powerless because you can't do it. So you stay stuck on that Lincoln Log. I think these Lincoln Logs are real key ways of looking at our addictive process. I don't think we've even touched how important they can be. So from my point of view, there's absolutely no question but what the society in which we live is an addict. We have wondered for years why recovery is so difficult. I think one of the reasons it's so difficult is because everything around you calls you back into the disease. It's like the siren song, constantly saying, come back, come back, come back. That's why we need support groups. That's why we need support networks in order to continue and progress on in our recovery. Because the society itself functions exactly like a non-recovering addict. And the norm for this society is non-recovering addiction. I believe that psychological, psychiatric, social work, counseling, etc. techniques do not touch addictions. That they are singularly ineffectual. Frequently, they're used to support the denial system and the addiction and cover it up so that people can continue in their addictive processes and get just better enough so that the heat is off of really looking at the addiction. And I think it's time that we see that that is part of the problem. Now, I want to say a little bit about the addictive organization, because my guess is that most of you work in one, have left one, are leaving one, are going into another one, etc. And I think that this is something we really haven't looked at, is the organization as Addict. Now, I believe that the organization is like the infrastructure that is holding together the addictive individual and the addictive system. And you can see this in any kind of organization. Doesn't matter whether you're talking about a multinational corporation, Fortune 500 company, your local mental health center, your treatment center, your women's church group, your men's church group, your Eagles, Elks. It doesn't matter what you're talking about here. I think that what we haven't looked at is the organization as Addict. Now, in a book that we have coming out in March, we look at the organization as Addict in four different ways. First is when you have a key person in the organization who is an active addict. Now, that person can be a top-level administrator in the organization. Doesn't have to be, and I think that's very important. Because when you have an active addict in an organization, that person is by definition going to be a key person because they take so much time and energy. Right? What we have found is there seems to be an inverse correlation between how high up the person is in the organization and confronting the addiction. I.e., the higher the person is in the organization who's an active addict, the less likely that addiction will get confronted. Right? Some of you are just seeing your own home places here, right? And, interestingly enough, I think there's a direct correlation between the amount of damage to the organization and the employees and how high up the person is who is a non-recovering active addict. Now, we haven't really developed ways of dealing with this at all. We have people who make millions in organizational consulting. My belief is that very often, if not always, the organizational consultant becomes codependent to the addictive organization and has helped perpetuate the addictive organization. What usually happens is these packages you buy do just enough to keep the organization limping along and never really deal with the real issues. So that we haven't looked at this at all. The second way, that thing that we look at in the book, is codependents and adult children acting out what they know in the workplace. Their same skills that they use to survive in an alcoholic or addicted workaholic family are being used in the workplace. Now, those skills may be, for example, to protect the active addict. Need to look at. For example, most organizations love codependents and adult children because they work their asses off. They're really good workers. But what we know, for example, with the adult children, is that adult children are real good lone workers. They'll work real hard, but it's real hard for an adult child to be a team member. We know that. We also know that adult children frequently have trouble with authority, no matter what or who the authority is, and will undermine it, try to get around it, etc., etc. We also know that adult children have learned to lie. They've learned to agree with authority and then go off and do what they want. And in an organization, that's an organizational problem. We have not addressed it as an addictions problem, which it is. Now, codependents, on the other hand, frequently have low self-esteem, frequently get their identity through their work, frequently confuse themselves with their work. They are their work. And that gets real messy. So what we see is that same kind of phenomena operating at an organizational level as we see in the family and in the individual. The third way that we look at organizations as addict is when, this is one I think is one of the most interesting, is when the organization itself is the addictive substance. One of the things that we did before we started working on this book is we did a computer search on books on workaholism. They don't exist. We found 2 serious books on workaholism. But we found a ton of information on stress reduction. So we started to look at that. I said, boy, this stuff is really popular, you know? Listen to this. I just think this is so fascinating. I can hardly stand it. It's a fix. No wonder stress reduction is so popular, like so many other techniques. Because what it does is it protects your supply. If you involve yourself in stress reduction workshops and plans, it allows you to continue to be a workaholic. Isn't that fascinating? I mean, see how tricky this disease is? So what it does is protect your supply of workaholism. The more you run, the healthier you eat, the more you work out, etc., 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 the more you can continue your addiction. Fascinating, isn't it, how this works? Another form of the organization as addict is the promise of the organization. It's real interesting to see what organizations promise. Adult kids, for example, really fall for organizations that promise to be a good family, to give you what you didn't get at home. Codependents and adult children, and addicts too, really fall for benefits. Think of how your benefits are your fix. Think of how you stay with an organization where you know you're at a dead end with yourself and your work and you're growing in your life because of the benefits. That's the organization as the addictive substance. Another form of the organization as addictive substance with a promise is that if you're with an organization that's going to change the world, very often you're addicted to the promise of the organizations. We do a lot of work with religious orders and with, I sort of quit this one, I'm actually working with churches, but I decided I couldn't, the Presbyterians taught me that I couldn't stay sober and work with the church for a while. And But we find very often in church organizations that people are addicted to the promise of the organization, even when the way the organization functions has absolutely nothing to do with what's promised. Think about it in your own organization. That the way it functions is antithetical to what it says it's about. You still are hooked by the promise of the organization. And oh God, this is time is always such a bore, isn't it? The fourth way that that we look at the organization, is the organization as active addict. That the structure, the personnel policies, the mission, the product of the organization are all what you would find in an active addict. Now let me just give you a quick example of this, because I think this one's a little hard to grasp. It's very easy. Just as we were working on this book, there was an article that came out in the New York Times business section, lead article, A New Breed of CEO, Chief Executive Officer. It's talking about the multinational corporations. Fascinating article. I don't know how I ever read it. I really usually throw that section away, but this was a good article. What it said was the multinational corporations are in big trouble. Right. We all know that. To me, this article has fascination on two levels. What it then did was analyze what's wrong, what's happened and what's wrong. Right. It says multinational corporations after World War II are two major competitors in the world market. Germany and Japan were basically destroyed, and so we had an easy world market, and we moved right into the corporations aren't used to world competition, blah, 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 blah. The products are not holding up, it's not responsive to the world market, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Everybody with any sense would see that the analysis was correct. What happens, and I think this is one of the things that happens in our helping profession, was that when the analysis is correct, we tend to believe that the solution is also correct, even when the solution is off the wall. And I think this is real key in seeing what we do here, because frequently our analysis is good, but what we do with it is from our addictive thinking. What they did with it was they said the new breed of CEO has to become, and this is a word they use throughout the article again and again and again, more ruthless. Ruthless. The new CEO has to be less concerned about personnel issues than before. The new CEO, the new breed of CEO, has to be willing to do whatever they need to do to corner the world market. The new breed of CEO has to give up on long-range goals that are non-productive and focus only on short-range solutions that produce revenue and increase the profit margin. On and on and on and on. Now, as I read the article, one of the things that struck me is this is exactly what an alcoholic would do to try to shape up their family. Exactly. And what we're seeing it at a multinational corporate level, that the kind of thinking which was thought to be the solution of the problem is exactly the kind of thinking that we would find in an active addict. And we are seeing it acted out on an organizational level. Now, I don't have time to go into that today, but we have some suggestions about what we think can make some changes for organizations that are willing to recover. Interestingly enough, we're getting more and more inquiries from organizations who are recognizing these issues and saying that they know they need to recover, which I think is absolutely fascinating. Now, just 2 minutes about the living process system. I've been really, I think, doing a lot of work on trying to name what is. Simultaneously, for the last 15 or 20 years, I have been developing and working with what I call the alternative system, and I call it the living process system. It's what in women's reality I call an emerging female system. I believe that one of the things that happens in an addictive system is we try to static the universe. That's part of our control issues. And one of the things that all of us know deep in our being is that we live in a process universe. That the universe in which we live is a process. It's not static. We're not static. We change all the time, and everything around us changes all the time. We do not know how to live our process and to trust our process. I think it takes a great leap of faith to trust our process. And yet I believe we have to learn to live that way if we are to recover and be in touch with our spirituality and our sobriety and our own process. Now, I think of this system as a series of spheres. The biggest sphere, I think, is like the process of the universe. And it's ever changing. See, we've tried to make that static and call it God and make it look like us. I think it's a process. And it's always changing. It's never the same. Now, the important thing about that process is that it affects us. And this is something we've been in denial about, we affect it. Who we are and what we do and what we choose to do with our life affects the process of the universe. Then the next sphere, now remember these spheres are only imaginary, they're not real. The next sphere is the process of the planet. That the planet itself is a process. It lives a process. And that process is ever changing. I don't think there's any place that you would know that more than up here in Alaska. You can just see those changes all the time. And again, that process affects the process of the universe and is affected by the process of the universe. Then the next sphere is the process of our society, whatever society we live in. And that also is a process. It's ever changing. Look what we're doing with the Supreme Court. Look what we're doing, backlash on this and backlash on that. It changes all the time. It affects these other two and is affected by them. Then there's the process of our community. Most of us belong to more than one community. And our communities are a process. They're ever changing. And they're affected by all these other processes and affect them. Then these last two processes, the processes I think that we've tried to deal with in psychotherapy, but we haven't recognized that there are these other processes too. This one is the process of your extended family. That even if you're an orphan, you have some kind of extended family. And in a living process system, in some ultra mega way, there really is no right or wrong. At some level, it doesn't really matter whether you were molested by your father, beaten, poor, rich, overindulged, spoiled. It really doesn't matter. The issue is, what is your process? What is your learning about that? What does that have to do for you? What do you need to work through about that? Because you are that process. And when you deny that, and when you don't work through whatever you need to deal with about that process, you don't claim your own uniqueness. Then this last process, and I think this is one that we've tried to ignore in an addictive system. This last process is your own individual process. That each of you is a process. You are here to live that process. No one else has your genes, your chromosomes, your experience. Only you. You need to live that process. Now, I believe that our process affects the process of our family, of our community, of our society, of our planet, and of our universe, and is affected by that. Now, paradoxically, these spheres are all separate, and they're also the same. See, an addictive system can't deal with paradox. They're also the same. One of the things I know about myself is when I am living my process, that my process is God. God is more than my process. And that when I'm in touch with and living out of my own process, sobriety, spirituality, that I am one with all these other processes. I am participating in the hologram of the universe. When I am out of touch with my own process, I am out of touch with all these other processes. Now, in the therapeutic work that I do, and I really don't use that word anymore, I use facilitation. One of the things that I think has happened is because none of us really grew up in a process family, in a process universe, a process school, or a process church, or a process whatever, that all of us have inside of us aborted, distorted, pushed down processes that we haven't dealt with. Those processes, I think, are what Freud called the boiling cauldron of the unconscious. He was scared to death of it. He was an addict. He tried to control it. I believe those processes are there, always waiting to be worked on, to be finished, to be gotten through. They give us every opportunity. If we miss when a process comes up to be worked on, it will come up again. I think of our inner being as very conservation-minded. It recycles our shit and recycles our shit. If you miss it one time, you'll get another chance. It's a neat thing about our inner beings. I believe that when those processes come up, they need to be facilitated, supported, and that they can be worked through. I also believe that when we use techniques to wrench those processes out, it's like using forceps in a normal childbirth. And that very often we not only destroy the process, we destroy the product of the process, or we damage it. So that the work I do is to facilitate what is ready to be worked with, what comes up, and not wrench it out of people. And not try to be in control of it. Now, I believe as we work through those aborted, distorted, pushed down processes, we have an opportunity to be more fully who we are, to live our own process, and be in touch with our own being and our own spirituality. I think of the universe as a huge puzzle, and that each of us is a piece of that puzzle. Nobody has your experience, your genes, your chromosomes, your you-ness. When you don't live your process as fully as you can, there's a hole in the puzzle. I believe that we have reached a place where we are living in a universe with a lot of holes in it right now. And that we are desperately in need of people working through their own deep process work and coming to take their place in the puzzle. In order to do that, I believe we have to work simultaneously with healing the addictive process and learning to facilitate and live our own individual process. and facilitate that in other people's, in organizations, in the systems, and on the planet. So that's what I'm about. Stopping.